So welcome back, or welcome if you haven't made it to one of these yet. I am doing a series of chess lectures on things that I find interesting, and hopefully, simple concepts, things that are generally appropriate for all skill levels. So this particular lecture is going to be on the subject of weak diagonals. And we're going to look at some very simple attacks and easy ways to go wrong, and then substantially increase the complexity as we keep going. Okay, I've got 4 or 5 different games to look at here. The last one, I will keep my promises, being a game by Robert James Fisher. So we'll try and get through everything in short order. But okay. A quick recap of something that I think is really critically important from last lecture for everybody who's just joining me for this one, which is the 3 guiding principles for how to play a good chess game. The 3 guiding principles. So these are the 3 basic guidelines you can use while you're playing to try and figure out what the heck am I even supposed to do besides make checkmate, which hopefully you've gotten at least that far. So the 3 principles are, number 1, to develop your pieces. Okay, so by develop in chess, right, we mean to improve, right, or to increase the influence of the pieces. Okay, and who do I mean by the pieces? I specifically mean the knights, the bishops, the queen, the king, the rooks, okay, this sort of thing. And I'm realizing suddenly that I am having a technical issue where I cannot seem to touch the pieces while simultaneously sharing the screen in this limited way. So that is very interesting. And you're going to have to give me a second here. All right, we might just have to open this thing up. Just give me a moment to fix that, and we'll get back to what we're supposed to be doing. Okay. So it's fine. I wanted to try and hide the notation sheet, but it's more important to me to be able to do things like this. Everybody can still see?
Yeah.
Good. All right. Good. Okay. So yes, as I was saying, right, we got to develop our pieces. The pawns are technically, if you want to talk about development, not pieces, right? They're not categorized with the rest of the crew. Why? They're slow. They only control maximum 2 squares. They don't go backwards, right? They're very important, but they are not part of this basic principle, okay? So we want to get our pieces out. A really good metric for good development is to think about trying to connect your rooks, okay? So we want to get castled, of course, right? But also there is this idea that if we continually move our pieces in the direction of getting everyone off of the back rank, and our rooks can see each other, we're probably playing sensibly. Okay, so this is the idea of development. All right, enough said about that. We also want to control the center. I was brief about this last time. I'll be brief about it this time. The center is the shortest distance to any place on the board, right? I mean, if you want to be able to play flexibly, and you control the center, you can attack over here, wait till your opponent commits all his forces, and then shift the attack to the other side. Okay, so this is incredibly useful. So develop your pieces, center control, and the last one is a bit of a no-brainer, hopefully, which is to castle your king, to safeguard your king, because if you get checkmated, the game is over, which actually leads me very nicely into our first idea here. So this concept of weak diagonal is best illustrated by looking at the E1 to H4 diagonal that runs between the king and the side of the board. Okay, black has the same diagonal from E8 to H5. Okay, so here's this diagonal. All right, this diagonal is particularly tender in chess. And the reason is because if we look, we notice that the F pawn, which is on this diagonal, is the only pawn that is guarded only by the king. All the other pawns have some other less important piece guarding them. This pawn, right, F2 and F7, I call them Foolish Freddy, right? When I teach the kids, this is the common nickname. Okay, this is particularly tender, just to demonstrate the point. Let's say that white opened the game with F4, okay, opening this diagonal. And then black proceeded by playing E6, and now this move is actually playable, but let's say that white follows it up with like G4, okay, which really opens this diagonal because now you notice there's no G3 closing it off again. Does anybody see how black can just end the game here?
Yeah.
Go ahead and speak up.
Queen to H4.
Yeah, queen to H4. Thank you, Chip. Right, queen to H4 and the game's over. Kind of hilariously, right? The pawn can do nothing. The rook can't capture the queen because the pawn is in the way. The knight is quite cruelly too awkward to get anywhere that helps, right? He just can't get there fast enough. And similarly with the bishop, okay? White's got his own version of the same thing, of course, right? E4, G5, D4, F5, and now queen to H5. Okay, and again, checkmate. We call this fool's mate because, I mean, frankly, in order for this to happen in a real game, you have to really have no idea what you're doing. I have seen this once, I think in a bar. And I think I laughed out loud, which was not very polite of me, but I was just so surprised. Okay, but we're going to move on from there. And we're going to look at something that is much more realistic and that I actually see all the time at the scholastic level. You know, my elementary school students, they either play this or face this all the time, which is, okay, let's say we play E4, E5, and knight to F3, attacking the pawn, right, and developing a piece. And, you know, let's say that black is sensible enough to recognize the attack and plays F6. This doesn't seem so bad. I mean, we're, you know, defending, okay? But there are a lot of problems with this move, okay? So we have some problems that are a little bit unrelated to today, like we take away the knight's best square and we don't really develop because remember, pawns don't count towards development, right? And some of these things. But there's also an opportunity to create a massive attack. Anybody seen this before and already know what the idea is? A silence.
Well, can you take E5 with the knight? And then
Yeah, so we actually already are, right? This is a really excellent sign that things are going terribly for black, is that white is already pulling off amazing tricks, right? But you can actually sacrifice the knight on E5 because if black takes, here comes this move that we've already seen, queen H5, and this check is really, really difficult to deal with. We're going to look at this line in a second, right, where the king runs. But the obvious move, right, of G6, this is a really excellent way to lose quickly, runs into queen E5. I take the pawn. Okay, fine, you know, everything's okay. All right, we lost one pawn. What's the big deal? We develop, we block the check. And now, of course, your rook comes off. Right, and I think it's safe to say that this is going really badly, right? White is probably, you know, completely winning. I mean, you can come over here to stop me taking the knight, but I'll take this pawn, and you really have barely even gotten the game started. You cannot castle any longer. My queen is in your house. She's eating off of your plates, you know, and there's not a lot you can do about it, okay? Unfortunately, no help would be something like king to E7, because then again, queen E5, king F7, and now this one shouldn't be too hard. Okay, but anybody got an idea on how to develop another piece?
a bishop. Yeah.
Chip's the only one who wants to, oh, have we got somebody waiting to come in here? Oh, excuse me, Neil. Okay. Great. Okay, I'll leave that up to remind me to call on people and make you participate. Okay, yeah, bishop C4. Okay, and we're getting more pieces into the attack and the king is still miserable, right? So now for example, right, d5 might be a better try here, just to, even though it gives a pawn away, just to try and get some more pieces able to defend, right? But the fastest finish here is king to g6, queen f5, okay, king to h6. White plays d4, getting yet another piece into the attack. Black has basically one move that's worth anything, right? Blocking with the queen would be an instant KO. Queen g5, I just take it, that's checkmate. Okay, so we try and block with the pawn. And now a really cute move to get yet another piece into the attack would be to play h4, right? Where the rook now is going to be coming in. Okay, so fairly complicated, that line, I recognize, but you know, a lot of it's really easy to play if you just keep looking at opportunities to get more pieces into the attack, right? How can I get even more options on the king? Okay, and after h4, I think the game's pretty well over. Again, you know, this is not really prime real estate for your king. Hopefully you have at least that much experience with the game. We're trying to hopefully get castled, not, you know, lose a couple of pawns and have everybody still hanging out on the back rank. Okay. Fabulous. Any questions so far about this idea?
It goes without saying, I assume that, I mean, I'm going to ask a stupid question if I may,
Please.
with reference to the Morphy game, where the point was that he had major pieces, although Black was ahead, was ahead in pieces, he was behind in development, and so his pieces didn't matter. It goes without saying, I guess, if you can, there's a problem with chasing after pawns perhaps, but never after major pieces, right? If you can take a rook, you take it?
Yes, that's actually not a stupid question at all. Thank you for that. Yeah, I would say, you know, it's a tricky thing. Chess is a very complicated game, and honestly, the more I learn about it, the more awed I feel by how incredibly complicated it is and how little I understand it. But I would say in general that, you know, going after a pawn, going after something like, you know, one or two pawns out of the opening, if you're neglecting getting your pieces out, if you're neglecting getting castled, you're probably going to be in big trouble. But something like this, right, where Black is dropping a pawn and then very quickly dropping a rook, I think part of the trouble, Bill, I would also say that's even more helpful is Black doesn't really have development here that's significant enough to make up for it. Right. You know, if he could play knight f6 right now and try and trap the queen, and he would have some pieces developed, and maybe there's something. It still wouldn't be probably enough for the rook, but you notice, of course, that you can't even play that because the knight is pinned to the king. So, you know, I think the trouble here is that even the idea of Black being developed is so hampered by the queen being in the living room. You know? So I hope that helps to clarify that. But yeah, I mean, I'd say in most situations, if you're going up a rook, if you don't have an immediate problem, you know, like, well, I went up a rook, but I got mated, sure. But anything short of that, it's probably worth getting the rook. Okay, another quick game. This is a blitz game that I played. As usual, I'm making it through my entire lecture in like 10 minutes. But this is another game that I played recently, a blitz game that demonstrates some of these same ideas. If I can just get this guy to load. Oh, Lichess is down. Oh, fabulous. I was not prepared for that. All right, well, that's okay. I can make this work. Give me just a minute. Yeah, never had that one happen before.
This would take me 20 minutes to engineer.
Yeah, well, I can't believe that happened, but that's all right. So we'll go from here and hopefully that'll come back because I don't want to try and do the whole thing from memory, but it's fine in the meantime. Okay, a little detail along the way. So I had this blitz game, you know, I was playing white, right? Some guy was playing black, you may know him. And he played this. This is one of my favorite openings in chess. It's actually kind of lousy, but it's called Owen's Defense, which I will always remember because my math teacher in high school and first chess coach was Mr. Owens. So, you know, it has a bit of a soft place in my heart. But I want to talk about this for just a second. So he plays b6. His plan is to put the bishop here and have some influence over the center, right? Which makes some sense. But a really nice basic thing that you can hang on to from this lecture. When your opponent doesn't put a pawn in the center, right? When he doesn't play d5 or e5, when that's basically it, right? If he doesn't play one of those two moves, pretty much always the best thing to do is to get greedy. And by that, I mean to play something like d4 and just try and grab as much space as you possibly can. Now, you don't want to go beyond the two pawns because see my earlier point about developing, right? We want to get our knights out. We want to get our bishops out. We want to get castled, right? Getting beyond the two pawns is getting a little bit too greedy, right? That's a little bit more advanced. You're going to start paying the price other places. But in general, if your opponent doesn't put a pawn in the center, go for it, right? You're going to restrict a lot of his movement and have yourself a nice cushion out in front of all of your pieces. Okay, so this is exactly what I do. He now plays bishop to b7. Okay, attacking the e4 pawn, and I defend it. Now, there's a lot of different ways I could have done this. I could have played knight here, right? I could have played knight here, right? I mean, I could play pawn here, right? There's some other moves here, but this is a developing move, right? And guards the pawn and is a pretty flexible move. It gives me some other options. Okay, so my opponent now gets really clever and plays kind of a sneaky move, which is he plays pawn to f5. Okay, and this was a blitz game, and you know, as is typical for playing a blitz game, I didn't think more than like 3 seconds, right? And I took the pawn as a free pawn. Why not? Well, there's something kind of interesting here, right? Does anybody see what Black's idea was? Bill, Chip, or you know, anybody else who feels like contributing? Samwise? Are you muted still? Let me see here. Having some difficulty learning my controls, I confess.
He's pinning the pawn to the rook.
Yeah, so after this guy goes out of the way, right, he can just take this pawn right off. Thank you, Neil. And, uh-oh, I don't really have a good way to save that. I mean, at this point, you know, White's only two options to try and save the rook are either giving him the queen, right, which not exactly the trade I'm looking for, or we also, I guess, would have the option of giving him the bishop, right? He could play here and then I could shut him out. But both of these are really rotten and awful and completely losing. So not what you're looking to do. So the real question is, does anybody see what cardinal sin my opponent committed in order to play this magnificent trap?
Yeah,
Right?
he opened himself up to check.
Yeah, right? So he played this move that we've been talking about. He opened this diagonal that I thought you said we wasn't supposed to open. Okay, so queen h5. Oh, excuse me, I gotta let him play g2 first. Queen h5 now. Okay, which would be mate in one, except, right, he's got one little flimsy piece of cardboard that he throws in front of me. Okay, we take that. Now notice, if he tries to take the pawn back, I don't even need the rook. Right, this is just mate in one. Again, we have this weird thing where it doesn't seem like, right, I'm surrounded by all my friends. How could I be checkmated? Well, You know, strange but true, right? So he tries now knight to f6. Okay, planning, after pawn takes to snap my queen off and end the whole thing. Okay, you want any points with me, you got to see the whole combination here. But it's checkmate in 2 for white.
Well, you just advanced the pawn, G7.
So G7's not bad. G7's definitely not bad, right? This is almost certainly a winning move. He'll take our queen, but we'll take the rook on H8, right? We'll promote, hey, I got another one, right? And this is okay. However, Chip, I'm sorry, but you win no points for style. Right? So and here's why, right? You're still winning the game, but you have to think about how many more moves you're going to have to play here, right? There's no immediate checkmate. You have an advantage, but he is going to probably get the rook. And, if you make some inaccurate moves, we're going to have to keep playing for quite a while, right? Maybe you screw it up in the end, he slips away somehow. Okay, especially when you're playing blitz, keep that in mind, right? I've maybe only got 3 minutes of thinking time for the whole game. So if I've got a chance to end it now, I got to end it now. So pawn to G7 is not best, but there's only so many forcing moves here. I'll give you a hint. There's more than one way to use this diagonal.
Well, if pawn takes H7, then knight takes queen. Does my bishop do anything on G6?
He does an awful lot. He ends the game, as a matter of fact. Well done, Bill. Well done. Yeah, so such is the weakness of this diagonal, right? I mean, that's hopefully the impression that I'm successfully making here with all of you, right? Is that the simple version of this amounts to don't move the F pawn. Just don't do it, right? But the more complicated version is, be mindful of diagonals that lead towards your king, because things can get bad really quickly, right? And this game was over. It's interesting, Black can kind of hang on here if he doesn't go for the obvious attacking the queen. He can hang on by playing bishop to G7, because this gives the king a critical flight square. Right now, it's not mate in 1 anymore. He can run here if things get bad. So check and king moves, right? Check here, but the rook can take it. And I've actually lost a bunch of blitz games in this position, even as white, because even though white's doing incredibly well, see my note to Chip earlier, right? I've got to finish the game, and I only have so many minutes, right? So sometimes people like to play this junk in blitz because, they're like, well, it's junk, but you don't have a lot of time to figure it out. But in a slow game, right, if I had, as I sometimes do, 2 hours of clock, you don't see anybody playing this kind of nonsense, right? But anyway, so okay. This is a practical demonstration of the risks of moving your F pawn in the opening. Okay, all right. Let me just quickly see if I have to do the rest of the thing from memory. So be it. But let me see if I can get Lichess back. Yay! Okay, that's great. This is
I
why,
would say, John, that you pride yourself on your memory based upon a recent interchange. So I might have been useful to put you to the test there.
yeah. Well, in point of fact, that game was actually probably like 3 years ago. But I just never forget, a great win of my own. Okay. Speaking of, so I'm doing pretty well here. I will absolutely have this thing wrapped up by 2 at the latest, but we're actually way ahead. So I am gonna go ahead and show this game of another one of mine before we get to the Fischer game, who is, better than I will ever even dream about being. So we're gonna transition a little bit. We're still gonna look at weak diagonals, but now we're gonna see this idea of weak diagonal not just limited to, E8, H5 or E1, H4, right? This is, where do weak diagonals come up in other places in the game? And also, I wanted to give you all a chance to say, okay, but what if my opponent doesn't make this awful F-pawn move? How am I supposed to use anything that happened today? Okay, so we're going to look at some other things. All right, so this is a game, I played this, there's this amazing tournament in Parsippany, New Jersey every year in February called the Amateur Team East. Thousands of people come together from all over the country, especially the Northeast area, to play a team chess tournament. So that's pretty fun. You all play your individual games, but it's one of the rare times in chess where you can have a team atmosphere because you all get to sit next to each other, right? And your results are counted together. So I've been able to go a couple of years in a row with a great group of guys, and it's been a ton of fun. And if you have a couple of friends and want to play chess, it's all skill levels. You've got grandmasters playing, at the top of the tournament pile, but there are teams of chess dads and their kids, forming, and sometimes just college kids that barely know how to play that come together. It's really great, and everybody finds an opponent of their level. So Amateur Team East, hopefully by next February we'll be able to do that. I highly recommend it. So here's the game, right? Another reasonably short one. So again, I had white. And my opponent plays the French defense, right, which is this E6 move. So hopefully if you were paying a bit of attention earlier, my opponent didn't put a pawn in the center. So what am I supposed to do? Well, I'm supposed to grab, right? I'm supposed to get greedy. And now we understand what my opponent's real idea was. It wasn't that he was going to neglect the center entirely, right? He knows what he's doing, but rather just delay. So he now strikes out with D5. He is playing for the center, and this pawn forms a lovely support, right? He sort of sets up his defense before he leaps out, right? This is very, very standard play, right? There's nothing surprising about any of this for either one of us, okay? I play this little bit odd-looking move, knight to D2. I'm not going to get into this too much. It's really beyond the focus of the lecture. The knight could have just as easily come to C3. This is just a particular setup that I like. The main point is I'm defending my pawn, right? And he now strikes out with C5, okay? So he's, without getting too deep into this, he's trying to immediately create space for his pieces, right? Again, trying to get his own version of a big pawn center so that his pieces can come in safely behind. And also strike out at me, right? And create some possibilities for exchanges. Okay, I take, he takes back with queen. All right, small opportunity to test you on something pretty basic. So many of us have heard that bringing the queen out too early is a bad idea because the queen gets attacked and you end up losing a lot of time, right? Because she's just too valuable to come out early. I would love to play bishop c4 here, right? My knight would defend that bishop and I would get a free development move. I would hit the queen would have to go away. This is a terrible move. Who can tell me why? And, for purposes of forced participation, I will not accept answers from either Bill or Chip. So if you want to move this along.
Same as in the previous example, the pawn pinned to the rook.
Yeah, right? We can go queen to g2. Okay, so another basic principle, those of you who some of the more advanced things are just that, very advanced, right? Something really simple you can hang on to is every move you make has an arrival effect, which is almost always what you're thinking about, but it also has a departure effect, what it used to be doing. And it's very often missing the departure effect that leads you to lose games. Because now queen to g2, again, I'm threatening to take your rook. Now white can hang on, right? Again, we have this X-ray defense of queen to f3. But we dropped a pawn. Our castle position is ruined, right? The queen's come off. And white doesn't have a whole lot here. He's a little bit ahead in development, but he's down material. Okay, so, you're not lost or anything. I mean, there's a whole chess game to be played, but not ideal, shall we say. Okay, All right, so this is pretty easily dealt with. I just play knight to f3 first. Okay, covers my pawn, right? Blocks the attack of the queen, and now I can play this move as I wanted to. Okay, he takes the pawn in the center. I go ahead and pop him. Right, he drops his queen back. Okay, the most principled thing in the position. I'll keep things rolling, but hopefully you're paying attention, right? Castles makes a lot of sense. We're trying to follow our 3 rules. Okay, the center looks kind of funny, right? Things are a little bit weird here, and I am actually down a pawn right now. But I've got pretty good development, right? My king is castled. His is still in the middle. I feel pretty okay about the position so far, okay? He goes ahead and develops another piece. He wants to, right, get his king castled as quickly as possible. I go ahead and fix my weird-looking knight. Notice I have also ideas of attacking this pawn and winning it back. Okay, he develops, right? I'm trying to get to a particular place here, so I admit I am breezing through some of these things a little bit. Okay, we make some exchanges. Okay, and now here's where we start to get towards this idea of weak diagonal again. So, you know, I make another couple of preparatory moves. I'd like to be able to move my queen, but of course, right, my knight is currently hanging to a capture. So if I just do something nice, like, oh, queen f3, and, you know, well, that's another one of those little embarrassments, right? So, okay, c3. You know, nothing special about some of these moves, right? Like, it's good to see them and to look at how stronger players play, but, you know, I don't have a lot to say to them in terms of depth, okay? He drops his queen back and attacks my bishop. I put my queen on e2, developing, okay? Don't underrate the power of just getting pieces off the back rank, right? This is nothing dramatic, but it's useful, and it defends my bishop. Okay, bishop to d6. He's threatening to take on h2. I put a stop to that. Okay, bishop to d7. And now there's a really nice move here. We notice the queen is on the king. Okay, which means that this pawn is pinned. This pawn who normally captures either d5 and f5, right? If it did that, well, that's illegal, right? The king would be in check. So it allows me to do something which I really shouldn't be able to do, which is I can play knight to f5. Mm-hmm. And, you know, this move, I'm hitting this pawn, I'm hitting this bishop. You know, it's not especially clear what white's even up to, actually, because, you know, probably he could just castle and, you know, the pawn's protected and he's not winning any, I'm not winning any material, but you know, something kind of interesting happens because my opponent decides to castle queenside. And this move is really, really wretched, but it's totally unclear why at first. Okay, so this is where we're finally, at last, going to come back to the point. Okay, exchange off this bishop. Okay, and the queen comes here. And now, here's where we can bring back the Morphy game from last week. Right, which is when I talked about the Morphy game, we were looking at this idea of sacrificing on b5, right? And we had the idea of knight takes the pawn on b5 or the bishop takes the pawn on b5. And we were saying that it was better to keep the bishop because black in that game didn't have a light squared bishop. And so it's very powerful to have things that your opponent doesn't have. In this game, right, my opponent just lost his dark squared bishop. So suddenly, this bishop of mine is running unopposed. Well, okay, so what? Well, we're going to see so what. So bishop f4, hitting the queen again. Right? Queen to c6 seems like a completely normal move, right? Just preserving your queen. And I just want everybody to notice, okay, it may not seem like much, but this whole diagonal is mine. There's really no one on the board that can come onto those squares safely. at this moment, right? The queen, I would immediately snap it off. Bishop for queen turns out pretty good trade. Okay, the light squared bishop isn't helping out. And the knight, probably the best chance to try and fight against this, just isn't really that well positioned to do it, right? He's going to have to make some maneuvers. It's going to take him a couple of moves.
So
Okay.
queen e5,
Sorry?
queen e5 maybe?
Yeah, very good. Moving things right along. Okay, so enough is not as good as a feast, right? As the saying goes. I say, okay, why don't I put my queen on that same diagonal and really own it? Okay, I'm now threatening, actually, queen b8 is just checkmate. I kind of laughed when I played this move because I will admit, this all kind of just fell into my lap. You know, it wasn't anything really very dramatic. I didn't have to work very hard. I didn't take a lot of long thinks in this game. It's just the nature of giving up the dark squared bishop and then castling in the direction of where my pieces are going to be pointing, right? And I think it's important to recognize that this guy, 1750, to put that in perspective, that's a very experienced tournament player. I mean, my rating at the time of this game was only 1880, and you know, I'm an experienced coach and have been playing for many years. So the even experienced players, you know, just could not realize why this is such a problem. You know, it just kind of all fell together. This checkmate is really difficult to deal with. In fact, if I wasn't trying to get to the Fischer game, I'd probably ask you all some more questions, but I think I'll breeze it along a little bit. The only move that survives is bishop to e8, just on the pure fact that it creates a flight square for the king, right? So now queen to b8, king to d7, and he can stay alive a little longer, okay? Remember, we're trying to connect our rooks. Bishop's going backwards and separating the rooks again, it's not a healthy sign in your position, right? If this is your only move, things have not gone correctly, okay? And what makes it even worse is now there's a very logical follow-up here, which is, okay, I think I actually threw in queen b8 here, but it amounts to the same thing, which is you could also just play rook to d1 with the idea of just taking the square away again. So he spent his whole turn, right, giving his king this flight square, and I just develop another piece and take it away. Right? I know in the game, I think I actually threw this check in first, and things got a little bit more complicated. There were some tactical things here, but you know, it's not super critical at this moment. Okay, I drop the queen back. Okay, and now I'm threatening to just take on d5 with the rook, right, and crash through. Okay, he has to put his king back on c8. Again, notice the inspiring chess moves that are happening on the black side. Okay, and I think we can, in the name of getting to the end of this, right, I play c4 to open up more lines, right? Notice this gives increased scope to my rook. If he takes, the rook will then be free to move, so capturing would just lead to checkmate, because again, he doesn't have this flight square anymore. Okay, so in the game, I think it finished, right? He played f6, and now check, check, check. Okay, and I think we get the idea. I'm up a rook, his king's on the run. Okay, well, I'll play this out really fast. And then finally, actually, the thing ended with yet another weak diagonal. We noticed that this move of trying to, you know, get the rook out and create some defense also meant that his king is that much more hemmed in by his pieces, right? Notice how, again, he's surrounded by all his friends. Okay, now queen e4 is actually a mating attack because the king's only block is to play f5, and that was the end of the game. So my opponent actually resigned after queen e4, right, because he could see what was coming. Okay, weak diagonals, weak diagonals.
Can
This
I just
game,
one quick question?
please, please.
One
I'll go
of
back.
the issues in the candidates match was when you know, super grandmasters were up a pawn or so and looking to the commentators like it was a win situation. Why didn't they resign? And so this was a question for the day. Is there a certain level in your experience, you know, you've talked about a 1750 player, does that person in this context think, well, it's possible that John could blunder, even though I'm down a rook? Or should he really have said, well, I'm screwed, it's toast, I should have resigned several moves before?
I would have, you know, if this were me, I probably would have resigned. You know, it really depends. If I was playing a stronger player, probably I would resign. Let me find it. Probably when I went down the rook, you know. Hang on. User error, hang on. Probably, yeah, I just cannot find this line. Yeah, probably somewhere in here, right? When he played F6. I would have resigned, but children never resign.
Right.
Basically ever. What children do in tournaments is they never resign. They offer you draws repeatedly, right, over and over again, sometimes on every move. This kid didn't, bless him. He was a gentleman. But they offer you draws when they're losing. And then if you make a mistake, the draw offers vanish mysteriously. The other thing that kids do that's really, I totally understand, but I gotta say when you're an adult having to play children, it's rough, is they have their moms like come in and just hella drop snacks. So you're in like hour 4 of a tournament game, and all of a sudden this little boy has like another fresh thing of water and a cupcake and like all this little stuff brought to him by his mother, you know, in the middle of the game. It's definitely psychological warfare.
So you're asking somebody to bring you snacks.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's hard to get. Sometimes my buddy Andrew will bring me a snack, you know. Okay, we made it. I'm going to forego some of the history today. Frankly, I thought about it, but I feel that there's been more than enough said about Robert James Fischer. One thing that I will say is if you're really interested in learning more about Fischer, the 2 books that I can highly recommend are Endgame by Frank Brady. That's a fabulous book that takes on Fischer's whole life. It's exhaustive, and as a result, sometimes exhausting, but really wonderful at giving you an impression of how he became the player he did and looking at the sad history after he won the world championship. And then the other one that's a little more focused is Bobby Fischer Goes to War, which I regret to say I forget the title, but I'm the author, excuse me. But that book focuses entirely on the lead up to the 1972 World Championship, right? And is a fabulous book and really clips along really well. So those are wonderful. And if you want to learn more about him, you know, I recommend it. Okay, here is this game. I'm going to breeze through the opening a bit so that we can get to the parts that are most relevant and also get everybody out of here after an hour. So Fischer has black in this game, okay? And, you know, we see both sides make what are very normal opening moves, okay? We see play for the center, right? Both sides are developing their pieces. We have some little exchanges at the beginning, okay? But in general, you know, you notice within, what move are we on here? Hang on, I'm gonna move some controls. So we are on move 9, and already both sides have castled, right? Have developed both of their knights, and created actually a very symmetrical game, right? Things are pretty much exactly the same on both sides, although this is not something that total novices would probably play, right? They don't tend to do setups this way, okay? So, in fact, actually, there's a comment here that, you know, one of the things that's really important in chess is to try and introduce asymmetry, right? To try and create an imbalance. If both sides keep playing the same way forever, you either get white wins or a draw. So especially if you're Fischer playing black, you're trying to look for an opportunity to create something, right? So this is probably the first interesting move, in my opinion, right, that's happened so far, is Fischer now says, okay, I've got 2 pieces left to finish my development. Okay. And, you know, okay, I could put this bishop on b7. I could put this bishop on g4, right? I could put this bishop on f5. I've got a lot of different choices. But there are a lot of problems with a lot of these choices. Okay, so bishop on b7, very simply, is just purely defensive, right? I would be guarding my knight, but this pawn in the center is going to block it from having a lot of potential. It's not going to have a long diagonal to play with, and probably just kind of uninspiring. The problem with the other moves, right, like bishop g4, well, now we see why white made this kind of strange setup of his knight coming to e2 instead of, you know, the normal move of f3. Okay, white can now play just f3. And the bishop is kind of running short of squares. I mean, if you try and back up, right, the bishop is lost. That's a trapped piece. Okay, and if you come here, well, now maybe I can continue to roll with these pawns, right, and just get a really big pawn center and just keep pushing you around. Probably a subject of another lecture will be, you know, the effect of a big pawn center and how you can use it like a snowplow and just push the other guy off the board. So Fischer says, okay, I don't really love any of those options. I'm going to put the bishop on a6, okay, and kind of be annoying, right? Just pin this knight to the rook for a second here, okay? Black says, hey, what a great idea. I'll basically copy you. Fischer plays rook to e8, gets out of the pin. Queen to d2, and now here's where the game finally gets interesting. Okay, in order to continue to fight for an advantage and keep things moving, okay, we've got our bishops out, we've got our knights out. Okay, the pieces that I would say are most obviously not participating are what are called the major pieces, right? The rooks and the queen. Well, in order to get the rooks and the queen involved, right, one of the things you really want to get is more open lines, particularly open files, right? What's file is what we call the lines that run from our opponent back to us, right? And ranks are the ones that run from side to side. Okay, so trying to create opportunities to have open files is very important. And it is for this reason that Fischer now breaks in the center with pawn to e5. Okay, we got some fun tactics in this section. So black takes, or white takes, black takes back. And now it looks like white can maybe win a pawn. All right, something like knight takes, right, queen takes. But does anybody see what's wrong with this? It's kind of a big problem here. I am up a pawn for those of you who have completely lost track, right? But there's something hanging here that's going to be a problem.
The knight on e2.
Yeah, right. We can just rip this off. So, you know, bishop takes e2, and play might continue. You know, maybe even dump this here, right? Something like this. And now at the end of it, right, temporarily, what have I got? I've got 2 pieces for the rook, but it's actually going to get even worse than that because this rook doesn't have anywhere safe to go. If here, knight to f3 scores, right, and I pick up even more material, rooks are better than knights. And if over here, the same move actually because I've got this. Okay, but that's not even my favorite. My favorite is, okay, so I leave the queen back, right? I'm going to leave the queen back to guard on e2, okay? And I'm going to take with the bishop instead. And now black's got an amazing move, absolutely incredible, which is knight to f3. All right, a knight fork, picking up the queen. Well, hang on, wait, what about the bishop just comes back, right? Well, the problem with bishop comes back is that the queen is completely loose on this square, and so now I just take her this way.
Yikes.
Okay, so Fischer's got incredibly active play. All right, so Robert Byrne is a pretty well-known grandmaster in his own right and not a bad player, right? So he goes for none of these options and plays rook f to d1. And actually, at the time, right, thought he was winning because this pawn of Fischer's is what we call an isolated pawn. It's going to be very hard to defend. You know, it doesn't have any natural pawn allies on e6 or c6 to guard it. So, you know, White's thinking that he's doing very well at this point. Okay. All right, knight to d3, kind of a little bit of a strange move. Right? Doesn't look like the knight can stay here because after queen to c2, right, I am more than happy to trade this rook for these two pieces. Okay. And now here come the fireworks. Okay. Knight to f2. Breaking up, right, some of the king's pawn cover. And now we understand, right, after king takes, this move's a little bit strange, but now knight to g4. So my pieces are starting to swarm in. This pawn is going to be lost, okay? And we can see that a couple of things are happening, right? One of the things is that this diagonal to the king went from being very heavily guarded to now completely blown open. Okay, but the best is yet to come. All right, so Byrne has a note in this game that says, okay, he plays queen to d2, and he says, as I sat pondering why Fischer would choose such a line, right, because it's so obviously lost for black, he was expecting Fischer to, you know, take the rook, and then he would duly play rook to d1, and here, White is completely fine, right? He has, in fact, right, we notice the bishop, 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 bishop. Okay, he's got two knights for his opponent's rook. This pawn is still weak. He thinks I'm completely winning. But the true point of Fischer's sacrifice was to create a second weak diagonal, okay, and to take the bishop on g2. I will say as a side note, this game probably deserves a lot more time than I'm giving it, but here we are. Okay, so what's the point of this? Well, after the king takes, we've got this diagonal that is now completely blown open, but we've also got this diagonal. Now, at this point, hopefully some of you are thinking about, oh, okay, so maybe bishop back to b7, right? But this is actually not a good move at all. Right, this move is way too slow. After this, White can play the excellent move knight to d4. And your bishop is in the right place, but you notice way back at the beginning of the game, I said, right, this pawn is here and he's not going to move. So this piece will never actually get into attacking the king, and all of the ideas that Fischer demonstrates in the next couple of moves never happen. So what do you do first?
d4.
Like a freight train. I got to play it before he can, right? This move actually, again, 1, 2, 3 attackers against only 2 defenders, right? It seems like a total sacrifice of material, but if you understand it in the context of making sure that this piece has life, it begins to make a little more sense, right? So White goes ahead and grabs as much material as possible. Right? The bishop comes to b7, okay, and White plays king to f1. Now, there's a few different things we could obviously look at here for where the king could go, but I'd much rather look at the conclusion of this and have a little bit of time to explore for a minute. So Fischer now plays the most boring-looking, amazing move, and White resigns. So if you can, without peeking, your hint would be, think about trying to take advantage of this entire, right, new highway that you have built for yourself.
Well, queen to d5.
So queen to d5 is a beautiful, excellent, wonderful move. There's
Don't lose my queen.
consequence that your queen.
Smart blunder. Yeah.
Well, yeah, but this is fine. You know, you're in the right spirit, right?
So queen to f6.
So queen f6 is probably also doing well enough, right? Queen f6 is probably also doing well enough, but it does allow me more defenses, right? By coming in this way, white is better able to maybe interpose some pieces, right, and create some blocks. So this is really kind of interesting, right? He makes kind of more of a, he comes at it from a weird angle. One more shot at it, and then I'll move things along, because I had promised other people that I would be done by 2.
Say hi to Katie for us.
I will say hi to Katie for you.
So I don't remember this game very well. I thought he sacrifices his queen somehow or somewhere, but maybe I'm completely missing that for something else.
I think you're thinking of the game against Donald Byrne,
Okay.
right? Which is not, that's the game of the century, which I may look at some other time. But yes, there is a queen sack in that game, and it's against a guy named Byrne. I don't blame you. So, all right, that's fine. In the interest of, not making this too slow, right? The move is queen to d7, looking at coming in this way.
Yep.
Because you notice, such is my control of this diagonal that there's no interposing the queen on g2. So Robert Byrne resigned, right? And Fischer, this game is in Fischer's classic book, My 60 Memorable Games, which is, just a fantastic book. And it has been reprinted over the last couple of years. So it is now freely available again. For a long time, it was out of print. It is, the only book actually written by Fischer. Bobby Fischer Teaches Chess is a fine book, but, My 60 Memorable Games is by Fischer, about Fischer, and looking at 60 amazing matches. And in this game, in the end notes, after White resigns, he says, a bitter disappointment, because he had hoped that White would try to play queen f2, right, getting his queen over to defend some relevant squares, right? And the beautiful finish now follows of queen h3 check. Okay, now notice, I cannot run this way. Don't forget about the rook. And I cannot give the queen on g2. That wouldn't do any help. So king to g1. And now everything depends on this queen staying here to try and guard this square. This queen must stay here. She cannot go anywhere else. And that leads to an unbelievably beautiful move. You can understand why Fischer was sad he didn't get to play it, of rook to e1 check. If the queen takes, so first of all, the king has no squares. That's important. If the queen takes, you're no longer minding the store, and the game is over. If the rook takes, well, again, going back to an earlier theme from the lesson, we have the arrival effect. I won the rook and I ended the threat. Good for me. But the departure effect is that I was guarding this knight. And so now we come back to the second weak diagonal. And of course, the queen is in take. If we block with the rook, remember, you can't leave. You have to guard the mating square. So the bishop just takes that too. And, White can flail on, right? I mean, you could move your pieces around, but unfortunately, even an effort to say something like, oh, well, that's okay. I will just, give the queen and try and fight on with the few pieces I have left. The problem is that the queen is now pinned. And since the queen is pinned, she's definitely not minding the store. And so as funny as this might look, that's checkmate. And the queen is left to watch. Okay. Thank you all for coming. I got to wrap this up very quickly. I hope that was enjoyable. Please go play some games, and feel free to send them to me, if you have questions and that sort of thing. I am particularly interested if you have subject matter for future lectures that you want to see. I'm kind of doing things that I'm excited about, but I do get excited if I know that I've got an interested audience who will show up. That's definitely more fun for me. So by all means, send your ideas, whatever they are. I'm going to do at least probably 2 more of these. And I think probably the next one will stay on weekends because I think it's easier for a lot of people to attend. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks, man. That was fun.
Thank you.
thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. I mean, it's nothing without an audience, so I appreciate it.